Katie comes back, there were three were here last week, and I don't know if you guys were or weren't. I don't think you were. But if there are any questions you guys had from last week, I don't know if you wanted to raise anything before I move on.
You talked about the primacy of the conscience,
Yes.
Aquinas.
Yes.
And a friend of mine went there and he said, Aquinas said, in considering an issue, there is the greater good. Consider what is the greater good, if it has many sides. But does that conflict with, Pope Benedict always talked about the danger of moral relativism?
Oh, shocking, yes.
Yeah, so there's a conflict there?
Oh, there may very well be for Benedict, I don't know, but the issue, as one moves from the more general understanding of the good, it's good to take care of the poor, or it's good to be supportive and nourishing of your parents, or with, the other end of it, don't burn little children, that, or big children for that matter. Anyway, the more you get down into the particular, the more, the circumstance, the particularity, et cetera, how conflictual does it become? Well, it's always going to have an application to the concrete here. And what is done in this particular case under this particular circumstance may differ somewhat from another set of circumstances in another place and other persons. The understanding of morality in terms of personal morality, and I would say central to that was sexual morality. It seems like we were certain about sexual morality in amazing ways. How could we be that sure? But in any event, and being celibates, but in any event, there was an assumption that that human nature did not change, quote unquote, so that you could move from the general to the particular, and it would just be an application of the general to the particular. Well, human nature may not change in cosmic terms, but there are particularities with regard to every person and circumstance, and so we always well, rolling around here. I think there was a tendency to think that some things never changed. So I spent last week talking about change and how things have changed over time with regard to issues. For instance, the classic one is usury, the charging of interest for the use of money. Much more severe penalties attached to that than to anything related to contraception over centuries. And then circumstances changed. Usury became not usury per se, but charging interest for the use of money became a regular means of doing business over in a certain sense, global dimensions. It was the early version of a global economy, moving, the silk trade, moving out of China, coming to what would have been Istanbul, and then over to Venice, and then up to Ghent and Belgium, and so on and so forth, and an international trade, and then finished goods circling back around, and so on and so forth. And you needed money to change hands all the time to pay for services and product, etc. So this changed, and so I think Benedict has always been wary of any sense of change. I don't want to be unkind or too clever when I say this, but Benedict is more of a Platonist. The great idea, clear idea, and then you just apply it to the particular. It's a very ordered and perfect world. And the world of moral reflection, let's say in terms of personal morality, be it in terms of money, how we treat one another, lying, issues of lying, let alone the whole range of sexual issues and a host of other issues in terms of individual persons, are open to change. This does not mean that the values aren't consistent and, if you will, in a certain sense, changeless. It still is true, even though you are allowing for the reasonable charge on the use of money, it is still true that you're not to bankrupt the poor, which was the old concern about charging for the use of money. Okay? So yes, Benedict, and you know, there can be a kind of, and I'm not saying this of Benedict, but there can be a kind of flippant, oh, we got to be careful about relativism. Well, there is a certain sense in which everything is relative. The only thing that is absolute is God. God is absolutely simple and, in a certain sense, utterly unknowable. Mystery. And every particular thing has a certain relativity in terms of its relationship to us, to others, etc. So, one can make more of relativism than one should. There is a point that Benedict has with regard to, you know, I find in some of contemporary culture kind of a complete lack of what you would say morality, but yeah, I would say that, but also a complete lack of loyalty, of a sense of my word is my bond. You know, granted, one makes a commitment to someone and there may be circumstances in which that commitment may change. I allow for that. But generally, you know, there is a, it seems, well, I get into my sermonizing here a bit, but there seems to be, in so many respects, a kind of, what's one of the phrases that you hear amongst, I hate to blame young people because it's us old fogies who are as irresponsible as anybody. One of those wonderful phrases, whatever. You know, it's, we throw up a hand, whatever, as if, what does that mean? You know, where do we stand? Why do we say what we say, or why do we do what we do? Is there any conviction that we have that we're going to stand up for? So, I mean, Benedict's concerns are genuine, but he might find, in terms of someone like Judge Noonan's questions about contraception, he might find that very, very difficult.
You're saying Benedict.
Benedict, yeah, well, that was the name he brought up, Benedict,
Okay.
Pope Benedict.
The last Pope Benedict.
Yes, right. Okay. Well, let's begin to focus on Catholic social teaching. There's a remarkable history and development in Catholic social teaching which is generally accepted, that there has been development as time has gone on. In contrast, for instance, to being opposed to any sense of change with regard to any number of issues related to human sexuality, that when it comes to issues of social justice, there is the appreciation that circumstances and time and history and awareness change. And so the teaching undergoes change with that. It would be foolish and very misleading to say that every Catholic agrees with every jot and tittle of the social teaching of the Catholic Church. I mean, if you put Nancy Pelosi and Paul Ryan in the same room, both practicing Catholics, you would find, no, I would say yes, that's true. Both, I presume.
Quote,
I'm unless I hear to the contrary, I would say it seems to me that they make some effort at identifying themselves as Catholics. Maybe they don't go around with flags, but they do. There may be better examples out there, but you have two very different appreciations of things between them. And the same with John Boehner, of course, who, as he, with so many things, wore his heart on his sleeve, so to speak, in a lot of things. And to some extent, it was what made him charming and more approachable. Or at least you had a sense there was somebody there.
Yeah. I thought the timing of his resignation was so significant because it was right after the
Right
Pope
after the
died,
Pope came, yeah.
and he cried, and he
Yes.
and the next day
Yes,
he
yes.
resigned.
Yeah.
It's-
I don't know I don't know if anybody knows all the details of that and what the reasons were and so on. There are pieces and chunks of it, but we await Boehner's book to find out. And then we'll get the contrary opinions. But in any event, certainly he let loose with something about Cruz. But in any event, that there are differences amongst Catholics is understandable. Some of the disagreements over time find eventual resolution as the church walks with people and comes to understand the roots and history of various disagreements. Indeed, as one theologian wisely spoke of the role of authority and tradition, he said this: the practice of authority, let us say, is used by the Pope or bishops, but it could have application almost any place, including families, if you want to put it at that end. That's an important dimension, obviously. The practice of authority is to encourage conversation, not to stop it. We have a tendency to think about authority coming in and saying, everybody shut up. And I have the whistle and we'll march to my beat, et cetera, et cetera. It's an often invoked image and practice, and as often as invoked, it is almost as often a failure because it has a way of stifling conversations which then go underground and so on. And you hardly get people's attention, and what you want is their hearts, not just some kind of robotic-like response. At least, presumably, that's what you want. And the recent wonderful example of this exercise of authority can be seen in Pope Francis encouraging the bishops at the most recent synods, particularly the first one. I forget what year, 2013, I guess. Maybe, I forget what year, 2014 maybe. The two synods that were held on the family, he invited the bishops to speak up. And in fact, there were several occasions during that first session. I don't know so much about the second. Maybe they got the message by then. But in the first session, there was an enormous reluctance on the part of many of these bishops assembled to, in fact, speak up. Because the message they had gotten from the previous popes was, shut up. Frankly, that was the message. Don't say anything. Keep your head down. So you say it's a change of style. It certainly is, and frequently style is substantive. And this is one of those occasions. And many were kind of surprised and only reluctantly, I guess he means it. I guess he means it, that kind of thing. So, I want to make a couple of comments about the development, the history of the development of Catholic social thought, which are kind of interesting, I hope. First, unlike the hue and cry exhibited by, this was something I mentioned last week with regard to the birth control debacle, Cardinal Ottaviani and Father John Ford informing Pope Paul VI that he can't accept the recommendations of the Committee on Contraception because to do so would be to recognize change and hence the loss of authority. To admit change is to lose authority. This is always a dilemma. And it may not have anything to do with religion. Think about this in many, many dimensions. It is the common long-standing experience and reflection of the teaching church that circumstances, be they economic, political, technical, cultural, do change, and church teaching needs to reflect that change, precisely in order to be a reliable guide for human conscience. The feudal ages did in fact end. We can't put an absolute date on it, but they did end. There was a tendency, at least in some places in the church, to think that they went on and on long after they were over. And you had the beginnings of development of the modern state. Okay. Which happened with the beginnings of, the Renaissance and then not so much, the Protestant Reformation is part of this as well, but also the development of this economic development and global economy that's developing and so on across Europe. As a sign of this change and its acceptance, we have John Noonan's magisterial, which I mentioned last time, treatment of usury in church teaching is a case in point. I think it is essential to understand that behind the general acceptance of change in regard to social ethical teaching, there is generally a shared experience of social change and an awareness that the issues are terribly complex. War and peace, poverty and wealth, the movement in that teaching in terms of justice owed to persons who are members of the human society. There are three, Thomas Aquinas makes note, I didn't write this up on the board, but you can just hold on to this one. There are three understandings of justice. Justice fundamentally is what is owed to persons precisely by the fact that they are persons. What is owed to persons? Now, there is something that is called, I think, commutative justice, which is the justice between persons. I signed a contract with you, I've got to deliver the goods, or whatever, back and forth. There is the justice that exists that is called legal justice that a person owes to society. That there are rules, there are things that one needs to comply with in order to function in a socially respectable and lawful manner and just manner. This doesn't mean that the laws are perfect, but this is how we go about proceeding in terms of our relationship with one another. And then there is the third one, which is called distributive justice, which is the justice that is owed to persons by society. Now, this is the one that sometimes causes a great deal of consternation among some people. Nobody owes me anything, etc., that sort of thing. I picked myself up by my bootstraps, etc. No one has ever done that, by the way, in fact. And, for every energetic, daring entrepreneur, small scale or large scale, Henry Ford or whatever, who has come along over time, and we point to that person and say, there, that person did it, all on his, or in some cases her own. Well, that person who accomplished such remarkable things, particularly in terms of employment, the manufacture of certain things, provided goods and services for so many, et cetera, over generations, that person simply did not do it all on himself or herself. They were dealing with a reasonably educated population that was available to them, who could read and write, that they didn't pay for. That was offered to them. There were roads that were there. There were schools that were there. There were, et cetera, et cetera. There were networks of support and encouragement for families and others. Clean air, clean water, et cetera, a whole host of issues that enabled entrepreneurs to function at a very high level of both efficiency and also in contributing to the common good. But that this is connected also to things that were provided to them. Okay, sometimes this is lost sight of. So, granted that there is enormous complexity in many issues, there is a sense of the pace of change and the scope of change in our world. Who was seriously considering, for instance, the full range of environmental issues 100 years ago, maybe even 50 years ago? Rachel Carson, a voice out there by herself, more or less, and maybe some other heroes and heroines. But it's come upon us more and more. And we cannot avoid talking about and addressing these issues that are issues of justice in terms of how people live, how they are. You simply cannot say, well, I'm going to dig a hole in the ground and I'm going to take the raw material out and buzz it out by any means that I can, steam, whatever, and what's ever left over is none of my business. And whatever flows downstream is none of my business. Well, increasingly, that's no longer possible to say that. Some still do it, I grant you, but it's no longer possible simply to say, I have no responsibility other than to make a buck. All right. The Catholic Church, however belatedly or however shrewdly, and last week I made note of the fact that, for instance, the Catholic Church only in 1988 said that slavery was a sin. Imagine that. Long after the Civil War. And all that's involved. We're a little late on that, to say the least. But the capacity of the church to change and to develop its teaching in the light of historical, social, economic, and political circumstances points to the fact that, for want of a better word, data, D-A-T-A, matters. More information changes what we say is true. New data, much like a scientific theory or hypothesis, will tweak, modify, or fundamentally change the previous teaching. We see this in the case of usury, but it's true in other cases as well. And we see, I'm getting ahead of myself just a tad now, we see there were two, I grant, Well, I'll state it this way. There were two rather remarkable events. One has taken place already in Catholic teaching that, for instance, with John Paul II particularly, it got to the point where he insisted that capital punishment, the taking of life, legally, was no longer a moral thing to do. This is a change in teaching over time. It doesn't mean that we're saying kill them all, kill them all. I mean, none of that. But there was a good deal of cooperation in and support for capital punishment and so on and so forth, which now has almost been squeezed out of existence as a position that can be held with any degree of integrity. It's very interesting. Many people don't know this, but that's in fact the case. The other is the whole issue of war, which is now undergoing a more substantive review, again, brought on by some of the calamities of the post-Second World War, and some of the things that we see happening in Syria and so on and so forth today, and some of the issues, for instance, with regard to Iraq and so on. First of all, data matters, and the church changes as the data changes, and it has to reconsider its positions. The second observation for us Catholics is the rather peculiar observation, and this may strike you as strange, that the Catholic social teaching is largely unknown to most Catholics, especially among the very reasonably well-educated, professionally skilled ones. I note that many Catholic colleges and universities have strong business programs. We can argue this philosophically well into the night and well beyond my competence. I know with some of my Jesuit friends discussing what's the purpose of a Catholic college today. And within their experience, and mine at least, in terms of the great humanistic values and human liberal arts traditions and so on and so forth, that these are being increasingly squeezed out in a highly technical world. How many courses of English or literature do you take? How many courses in history do you take? How many courses, even in the Catholic College, in theology do you take? One, two, none, etc. But business has moved in as the dominant and attracting element in many Catholic colleges. The business school is triumphant. And obviously, money and so on are a big reason for that, marketing, finances, and so on. So I note that there's strong business programs at our Catholic colleges that attract many students. I wonder, with all the laudable efforts at promoting enterprise and creativity, market research and financial competencies, whether students are ever exposed to relevant critical courses amongst the social sciences, history, ethics, literature, even, heavens forbid, the Bible.
Can I make a comment?
Well, let me just finish this, then you can.
Okay.
A little pun that I throw in for free of charge. Did the prophets have anything to say about prophets, for instance? So much for that. Yes. Katie, what would you like?
No, I was just going to say, when I went to Aquinas back in the 70s, Aquinas was just the way you were describing a Catholic college.
What way?
Very oriented towards business,
Yes.
and the subjects that you had to learn to go out to get a job,
Right.
it's going back the other way now. You're learning a lot of ethics, a lot of theology, their programs, even their business programs are going towards sustainable programs, you know, learning that sort of things, a lot of business ethics, a lot of, you know, they're pushing in a lot of theology, a lot of business ethics, a lot of that into their business programs.
Well, let's see if it sticks.
Yeah, I
Let's
hope
see.
it does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's good to know. For all the staggering amounts of information that universities and other cultural outlets, media for instance, make available to all of us, is there sufficient encouragement to see how all the data, at least big chunks of it, fit together? Do we ever get the big picture, how it all fits together? Whatever our small patch of competence, how does it relate to other areas and so on? I am struck by how easily things are forgotten. I will mention to you now one remarkable example of forgetfulness about how stuff fits together. I claim in using this example that it is not peculiar to me or to my experience or circumstance or to the particular institution that I was in. I think it is a serious human reality that we have to pay attention to. A friend of mine used to refer to what he called institutional memory. When institutions undergo change, as they do, I'm very familiar with academic models because I spent 35 years at universities. You know, great professors and people who bring in oodles of dough from various sources in terms of projects related to research, et cetera, usually with a nice percentage above the cost for the university itself. You know, these professors and others move or die or retire. What happens in terms of the money trail? What happens in terms of what this was intended for? It's remarkable how quickly that is lost sight of. An example. This is not the example I wanted to use, but it's an example. But it's also the perversity of the human. Sin is ever much around us. My sister was a midwife and a public health nurse at a hospital in New York City, and it was downtown New York, and she was working with a physician, OBGYN researcher, who had received a good chunk of dough. How much, I don't know. A good chunk of dough in a 5-year program to test vaccines with regard to their helpfulness or not to fetus or fetal life. And the first 4 years of the program, the research was to be done on monkeys, which meant he had to buy all these monkeys and then keep it up and so on. Well, he just skipped that. He didn't bother with the monkeys. He just went right to human beings. Of course, this was a poor third world hospital on the east side of New York. People didn't know English, let alone how to complain, etc. And he came to my sister in the 4th or 5th year and asked her to sign off on it because he was going to be reviewed, and my sister refused. And eventually he got caught in something else of violence. Terrible example. But these kinds of things do go on at, you know, some of the best places. It isn't podunk you. It's some of the best of places. Anyway, so well, how do things fit together? The example I want to use is I was a chaplain at MIT from 1986 to 95. And I've been a very happy priest I would say, probably unusually happy over my life. I've had a pretty good life. I can't complain. Yeah, not every day was perfect, but who knows? But I've had more than my share of wonderful relational and personal experience and so on with people. So, and the highlight of that, there were many other wonderful moments, but my 9 years at MIT were a particularly rich and precious time for me. I was just the right age. I hit my stride, and so on and so forth. And I sometimes say, well, I was a real father. That was the generative moment there for me. Not just because of my own peculiar circumstances, but I really had the sense that I was generating life with these students, ushering them into the adult world, watching them grow up and become remarkable people, many just astonishing human beings. Anyway, so it was a great, great time. And one of the things that I became involved with, amongst many, many things, at what's called the Institute, MIT, was to make Martin Luther King Day special for the African American community of students and administrators and faculty, as well as Asian, Caucasian, and Latino communities as well. I was the only white person meeting with about 15 African American students, I think almost all undergraduates. I don't think there were any graduate students there. And 5 African American administrators and faculty. The particular task that we had was to market the day. There you go. Business. And the speaker. And one of the particular tasks was to create an attractive poster to be reproduced and spread around spread around the campus and in local newspapers and other outlets with a picture of King and some of his words, I have a dream, or whatever was going to be. And then also with a listing of time and date and speaker and so on, January 19th or 20th, whatever the date was, that Monday, third Monday in January. But the students wondered, this is before Wikipedia, what words would they choose of Martin Luther King's words? And one of the administrators just happened to have a calendar for the whole year, a Martin Luther King calendar, January through December. Different pictures of King in various moments, important moments in his life, Nobel Prize, this and that, and so on. Speaking to the garbage collectors in Memphis before he was killed, and so on and so forth. He had a calendar in which there were, short snippets or 3 or 4 lines of text about something King said on a particular occasion. And so you had at least 12 months of that. And the administrator said, well, why don't you look this over and choose one of the texts to put in of Dr. King's. And also, I would add that before the meeting ended that particular day, the project to get the poster was commissioned that day, and was our next meeting we would settle that. But on this particular day, the other issue that emerged was, well, how do we do this? How do we have a day for Martin Luther King, a day of celebration? They were completely, had no clue how to do it. So I watched them fumbling around, including the administrators and the faculty. Big help. And finally, the white guy said, well, why don't we do it like Dr. King did? Ta-da! Pray tell, what was that? Well, King would gather in the church. The people would gather, they would sing, they would pray together. And then they would go forward to the place, whether it be the mayor's office, be it a park, be it a lunch counter, be it the bus stop, be wherever it was going to be. We would march out in solidarity, one with another, singing our hymns and going to this place. And they were kind of, is that the way it was done? I said, yeah. I said, no, listen, I said, we're not going to use the little chapel, Kresge Chapel, because it only seats, 120 or whatever at most, or 75 or 80, I think, actually seats, but I would get in 175 in there on Sundays, 2 or 3 times. But any event, I said, we'll use MIT's grand entrance, its big domed area. It's kind of a quasi-church. And I said, the sound reverberates in this space. I said, we're going to get the Black Gospel Choir. And they're going to sing. What are they going to sing? He's got the whole world in his hand. And God knows whatever they can come up with to gather us together, faculty and students and administrators all together, linking hands. We shall overcome. I was thrilled to see this take place because there was Noam Chomsky, a noted person I had great admiration for, a very noted atheist. He had the whole world in his hand. I thought this was just terrific and fun. These Catholics are once again catching us off guard. And then we'll walk across Mass Avenue and we'll have the police holding up traffic and we'll march together. We shall overcome in groups of 4 or 6 across, arms locked together. We will. And they did it. And it worked. They were just absolutely amazed. Anyway, but for the next meeting, we needed that poster. And the students were chagrined. They couldn't find in the 12 months any words that were appropriate. Imagine the great orator, Dr. King, flunking MIT's edit. I was surprised. This is the pivot of the question, going back to the question, what we forget, what's lost in translation, okay? I was surprised and coaxed them to say more about their befuddlement. Well, they finally said, can we say this here? Well, there's just too much religion-sounding stuff in all these texts. Remember the stuff we're talking about? How does stuff fit together and how do we forget? Now, they raised this critical issue here. It's too much religious stuff. And there was complete silence, particularly among the adults, the black adults. I wanted to slam every one of them. But in any event, I just sat there and said, really? The administrators were hopeless. Finally, I gently mentioned, can you imagine me being gentle? I mentioned to them these exceptionally bright, young black women and men. Well, Dr. King was a Baptist minister. Inconceivable. I said he got his PhD in theology right across the river here at Boston University. Now that was 1988. 20 years after his death. And it's already lost. Amongst the best and the brightest. They had no idea about his Christian identity, nor about the Christian leadership in the civil rights movement. And I should also say, with Rabbi Heschel and many others, the Jewish leadership that was involved here. Very, very important. Particularly in terms of the difficulties that emerged in many areas in New York and other places between Jews and African Americans, I think was largely frightfully unfortunate and terrible. and again, a misunderstanding and not appreciating the involvement of the Jewish community in the civil rights enterprise. Amazing. So in our lives, in doing our lives with a commitment to loving our neighbors and treating them justly, we all need to be vigilant about the data, about how stuff hangs together, and how regretfully, and especially amongst the very best, some crucial data can be forgotten. So we always got to have that sense of remembering the tradition. Again, we go back to tradition. What was handed on to us, we have to hand on to others. And sometimes we get confused and we think there's nothing to be handed on. It's all on tape, or it doesn't count, or whatever. I don't know. In considering in our time and place the extraordinary tradition of social teaching in the Catholic Church, we can of course recognize that from its very beginnings, Christianity, a small embattled group of Jews who were fascinated by Jesus and his teaching and manner of life, fascinated with the openness not only to membership but to leadership in the early church, especially for the poor and for women. Christianity, however small, scattered, and threatened in the first 300 years or more of its life, was not a sectarian movement uninterested in the world and its problems. Its stance and view was outward. Go into the whole world. Don't stop just with your own. Go out to the edge. Also, the communal behavior of Christians, again for centuries, scattered and mostly in a minority status in any region, served as a source for non-Catholics in many cases to not only take note of such behavior, motivated by evangelical love and care, not just for the fit and the useful, but for all, the aged, the infirm, the dependent, but either to join in this Christian way themselves or to modify their previous behaviors through the adoption of social change to honor the common good of all people. I passed around that wonderful 2nd century Roman bureaucrat's remarks, which I think are wonderful. Christianity, as it grew in prominence and number, became a partner with the Roman Empire, now tottering, the Roman Empire, under the pressures of new peoples at their borders. And the church became very influential in civilizing various peoples through its communal witness, its developing schools, eventually universities later on in the 12th and 13th centuries, and its caring for the sick and for the weak and the poor, particularly at the beginnings of hospitals and other sources of respite and care for people. The things that Christianity invented. One area of social justice concern has its origins in Augustine, who lived roughly 354 to 430 AD, and his particular concern for the use of force in the continuing and lamentable behavior of war. The developing theory of moral reflection in this troublesome human activity stretches from Augustine to Aquinas to the Church's continuing contributions to the public consideration of warfare. The recent movie Eye in the Sky, which I found riveting, which has Helen Mirren in it, focuses on the applications of this centuries-old conversation to drone warfare. Something new and frightening. On the accompanying sheet, Categories and Criteria for Just War Theory deserves at least a little look. I gave you that sheet. Do you have it there? You have to look. It's under table 5.2. there are three general categories. One is jus ad bellum, jus in bello, and jus post bellum. Justice prior to war, justice in the conduct of war, and justice after war. One of the major concerns that the church has throughout this whole, one had the, well, my great historical awareness of all of these centuries often comes down to the Knights at the Round Table, for God's sakes. But it sounds so often that most of the time is taken up with these petty wars. One kind, or they're fighting one battle or another over some property or some well, later on the Crusades and so on and so forth. And what the church struggled to do way back when, and even into modern times and into our present time, is seeks to set a limit to war's horrors, seeks to limit, and one of the concerns it has is with civilians, with those who are not participants in the battle. How much do they get involved? You know, years ago when Knights were bold and all of that, the ones who were most affected by war were the combatants. In our modern sophisticated age, the one most affected by war are the civilians. They're the ones who are killed aplenty. Even in that movie, Eye in the Sky, with all of its sensitivities around the issue of, the particular issue is a little girl who is selling bread outside a house that they want to drop a bomb on. And the little girl is by definition innocent. She is not a part of the problem. So they decide painfully not to strike while she is there. Collateral damage and all of that sort of thing. And it's a very, very important question. Now, in fact, drone warfare, for all of this wonderful phrase that's used, surgical striking, and all of its exactitude, which is incredible in terms of computers, and all of this stuff is happening 7,000 or 8,000 miles away. You know, in Hawaii, they're focusing on Ethiopia. The maneuverers of this drone are working in Hawaii in a little trailer, basically, is what they're in. And the key players are in London, wanting to get these people to strike, etc. And the issue is the collateral damage. Well, in fact, this is something that the movie does not point out, is that drone warfare, with all of its, quote, surgical strike capabilities, has enormous collateral damage. Thousands of people not at all connected to, quote, the terrorists, or whatever is the phrase that's being used, are annihilated. This is not as clean as people claim it is. So this is a fact that needs to be held up and not allowed to overwhelm us with metaphors like surgical strikes and so on and so forth. You can look at the reasons. Are there just causes for entering in? A competent authority. The last one that's mentioned here, proportionality. The costs incurred by the conflict must be justified by the greater expected gains. What was one of those terrible events in Vietnam? It was something where we won the battle, but we destroyed the village, or something like that, or forget how it went. It's the annihilation exceeded the strategic reasons for engaging in the first place. The issues of proportionality continue in combat itself, and then the issues of reconstruction and justice that's involved there have to be also added in. One further example of the just war application was done in 1986 by the American bishops under the leadership of, the gentleman who wrote the statement, the final version of the statement is a gentleman up here, I list at the bottom, Brian Hehir, H-E-H-I-R. He has his doctorate from Harvard in political science and was the bishop's point person in the areas of social justice. The three persons mentioned there are extraordinary people. I know Brian Hehir, and I knew George Higgins. George Higgins was a remarkable man. Knew every labor leader in the United States on a personal basis. I met him at events with Cesar Chavez. He would just show up. He was always there. He was the bishop's person at all these events, and a wise and thoughtful person in terms of the issues of justice for the working people and so on. But Brian Hehir wrote the bishop's statement on the use of nuclear arms. And one of the things that the bishops came up with is no first use of nuclear arms. And no use if civilians are at all in range or targeted. And if there is to be any kind of use or consideration of such force, it has to be coordinated multinationally. Can't be just one deciding to go on their own. And there must be clear evidence, overwhelming evidence of weapons of mass destruction, as it was used in the text way back when. Now, some wonderful Christians, think of the Mennonites, and many rigorous Catholics, pacifists, look upon such a schema as mere rationalization of a monstrous human cruelty. Talk about differences amongst the brethren. Okay?
There was a meeting here some years, Pax Christi.
Yes?
Yeah, and then there was a nun in that group, and she said, Catholic Church should just scrap this just war theory.
Yes,
That was
yes.
her belief, yes.
Yeah, and now it's being reconsidered again.
Okay.
And a person who is leading the charge was somebody I know. I get emails from him regularly. He's married. He works for the religious superiors of men and women as their social justice coordinator, and really is leading on the issue of pacifism in the church. Now, however, Augustine and down through the centuries, equally thoughtful and morally sensitive Catholics have been troubled by the consequence of a disengagement from all use of force in the face of the massive loss of life of innocent people. Should we have left or leave the fury of Hitler or of Stalin, let alone of ISIS, simply to burn itself out eventually, reminiscent of Alexander of Macedon, crying at the Indus or the Ganges, whichever it was, because there were no more worlds to conquer? This is a difficult question. What do we do in the face of violence?
Didn't Pope Francis say ISIS has to be stopped? So how do you stop them?
Yeah, I know. Very, very difficult issues. And it's quite likely that, in many areas of life, when things take this out of the international realm and put it into the realm of some of our inner cities, we still use that term, inner cities, and the concerns about gang violence, very real issue in many places too. You get drugs, so on and so forth, and the enormous weapon power that teenagers have, and the frightening consequences of all of that. How do you compete? How do you address that? Do you address that with more weapons? The police. One of the issues that has been recently criticized from many quarters is what's, granted, this tends to become a purple patch or a kind of clever phrase, the militarization of the American police. They now, we have so many tanks, we have so many we have more military equipment than we know what to use. They're all stacked up somewhere around the country. And we keep making more because that's all part of the military-industrial complex. You got to keep building this stuff. Well, in order to sell some of it off, we're turning around and selling it to police departments around the country, with some perhaps revisions in the equipment or whatever, but nevertheless pretty imposing, powerful stuff. Turning it over to is that an appropriate thing to be done in terms of our own people? It's a very, very tricky issue. And the other issue is, to consider how we win over the hearts and minds of the people, not only in Vietnam, but in Baltimore and in Philadelphia and in New York and Los Angeles, places around the country. How are these places won over? Are they won over by more guns, or are they won over by food available, jobs available, educational programs available? The list is endless. And it's quite conceivable that this deterrent might be the better deterrent than meeting violence with violence. But these are issues that need to be discussed and argued, and not just reach for the next tank, which unfortunately is too often done, I think. And there was a very important person for Catholic moral reflection. He was a Protestant. His name was Richard Niebuhr, and his brother is Reinhold Niebuhr, who was a far more influential thinker in mid-20th century United States. He was a social ethicist as well. But Richard wrote a great book, which is still published today, and it's entitled Christ and Culture. And in this book, he provides 5 distinctive models for Christians to inhabit in terms of social justice teaching and action. Let me list the 5 of them with some brief comments, and then include some reflections from various Catholic groups that have critiques about these categories. You mentioned the peace group meeting here, and so on and so forth. So Niebuhr's 5 categories, which I list up there, and these are intended to have a certain, at least initially, pristine quality. You don't mix them. You look at them; they're blocked. They're separate. Each one is separate. You don't get one from column 1 and a little bit from column 2. It's all or nothing in a certain way for Niebuhr, in order to clarify the choices that are being made and what is the dominant metaphor that you are using as a Christian in terms of assessing what is just and right to be done. So the 5 categories are Christ against culture. The second is Christ of culture, prepositions of course. Christ above culture. The 4th is Christ and culture in paradox. And the 5th is Christ transforming culture. So just a brief word about each of these groups, and then some comments from maybe 3 or 4 critical Catholic groups. Christ against culture has a whiff of, dare I say it, us against them. It has the allure of clarity. Some of this against quality involving Catholics and the public culture can be seen in some of the abortion debates and positions, as well as in the care, treatment of those who are dying. This against quality finds expression, which I find a troublesome expression that John Paul II used, the culture of life and the culture of death. And of course, we're the culture of life. Too bad about you. You can just imagine how screechingly to a halt this brings any kind of dialogue. Oh, you're the representatives of death and we represent life. Thank you, but no thanks. The Christ of culture points to a very close relationship between, let us say, Caesar and God. Let's have a law. Okay? Let's have a law that applies to everybody. Years ago, I was in San Diego and got called by the bishop to come to a meeting. I've been called by the bishop on a number of occasions, very few of them happy. And I was wondering, what did I do now? So I got into my uniform and went down to lunch with the bishop and a whole bunch of priests, 30 or 40 priests of the diocese. And it's like the Music Man. We've got a problem. There's trouble in River City. What's the trouble in River City? I didn't know this was transpiring. The trouble was that there was a nude beach. Actually, it was in my area. Now, I wasn't responsible for this nude beach. I never got there myself personally because I couldn't walk up the hill from going down the hill. It was 400 feet up. But in any event, there's this nude beach, and this is immoral. And so we have to come together as Catholics, and this was a nude beach that was legally allowed in San Diego. I think it may have been the only public nude beach in the United States. I don't know if that's in fact the case. And you could see offshore in these big yachts, these old guys with the looking, just incredible. What hypocrisy. Wouldn't you be shocked you'd have to leave? But no, they're gawking away. And so the whole moral force of this afternoon was to tell us, after we had steak and whatever else we had, some first-class dinner. Anyway, take care of the clergy. And the bishop turned it over to this lawyer. It was very unclear. I started asking to myself, well, who's this guy representing? What's going on here? you know, this, I mean, is it as clear as they're making it sound, or is it a little bit more self-interest? So I let it go for a while. Then it began to dawn on me what was going on. This lawyer was a lawyer for the real estate brokers in the area who were upset at the Marines coming down from Camp Pendleton and coming down and urinating on the rose bushes before they went down to the nude beach. So this is the great moral issue, is the urinating on the rose bushes of the billionaires.
Oh my gosh.
You know, and I said, is this something we want to exercise our moral capital upon? I just thought this was crazy. But this is, again, this Christ of culture, and we think we can make a law that just will take care of everything. It's always a temptation. The Christ above culture has a good deal of what Luther referred to as the two kingdoms approach, where the Christian entrusts their energies to the kingdom of Christ to come, but is not as antagonistic to the world culture as suggested in Model 1. It allows the world culture to go on its own, so to speak, and you have a kind of a separation between Christianity and the world. Then you have Christ and culture in paradox. And this fits very much Augustine's understanding. Augustine, strangely enough, Augustine is always accused of being too harsh and terrible and so on. Actually, he was the great fighter against the Puritans of his time. He was the proponent of the middle way, wherever it was, strangely enough. He's always pictured as this, kind of, hellfire and brimstone kind of character, but he's not. People who thought that, for instance, we should just tear up the evil parts of the world and throw them in the flames. Augustine argued that we sometimes didn't know what the evil parts were. And he used the image of the weeds and the good grain in the parable. And he said, we let them go to God's good time, and God will do the separating. We don't worry about overdoing this. It involves patience and great humility in dealing with the sinful world, to say nothing of our own sin. The final model, Christ transforming culture, is in some tension with number 4, because it urges the followers of Christ to confront the evils, the injustices of our time and place. As we say in Advent, now is the time of salvation. Now. And this Christ transforming culture tends to be the one around which most Catholics coalesce. Even though they may not realize this, but they have a tendency to say, well, gee, there's something wrong. Is there any way we can work this out with the world that we live in without getting into an us and them kind of thing? Are there any kinds of ways that we can find the common good, the common ground, the way of preventing some of the worst examples of human cruelty and violence and so on and so forth? So this is certainly largely the Catholic area. Now, some critical Catholic views. Progressive Catholics generally identify with the transforming model, that we are called to love our brothers and sisters and to remember the wonderful snippet of Augustine that justice is love in the concrete. We're called to love our brothers and sisters, and to do justice is to love them now. The neoconservative Catholics would stress Model 4, the paradoxical involvement, for they would agree that some of the more secular offices of society, the military, the economic world, do at the very least a moderately effective job of alleviating human injustice and inequality. Hundreds of millions of Asian subcontinent, India, China, and so on, and Africans as well to some extent, have in the space of the last 30 or 40 years been lifted out of dire poverty into a better life by, among other things, the marketplace. All right? So that's the neoconservative position. Huh? The radical Catholics, Catholic worker model, pacifists, etc., you mentioned these, would stand very much in the against model or look, and look at choices as questionable compromises. This is part of this conversation that now goes on. The feminist Catholics it's important to realize that most of the feminist theologians in the last 25 years are Catholics. They couldn't become priests, but they all became theologians. Much more so than the Protestant world. Very interesting. And many women who have been ordained in various other church traditions look to these feminists for their insights in terms of the gospel and in terms of what they ought to be doing. Feminists are suspicious of their progressive and neocons' too ready acceptance of the status quo from the perspective of race, class, privilege, and gender. Allied with feminist Catholics are a rising group of Catholic theologians and ministry people in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. I have enclosed, again, a brief set of comments, which we can't touch upon right now, of ethicists from Tanzania, from Brazil, and from Sri Lanka for your perusal. These people are looking at what is justice from the perspective of the poor in the world in which they live. So, the theologian from Sri Lanka points out at the end, he says, the difference between the richest and poorest countries, the difference in 1820s was 3 to 1. People who lived in wealthier areas, they had 3 times as much money and wealth than people who were poor. In the 1950s, it was 35 to 1. In 1973, it was 44 to 1. And in 1992, it was 71 to 1. So the issues are not getting better. There was a wonderful movie that I showed last year called Monsieur Vincent, Vincent de Paul. Vincent de Paul spurred a movement which continues to this day, the Vincent de Paul societies, in every parish, in every part of the Catholic Church, around the country and outside, around the world. A movement of persistent and astonishing practical charity, which through the centuries has vitalized the Church and our societies all over the world. It's characterized by hands-on charity, food, clothing, medical help, housing for the poor and the destitute. Indeed, it is an extraordinary effort. We have a clothing operation right next door, etc. Francois Renoir, who was the director of the film, Monsieur Vincent, who was the son of Claude Renoir, the Impressionist painter, it's a wonderful film. At the end of the film, the last scene has Vincent sitting in a chair. He's dying. He's 80 years old, close to it. And he's slumped in the chair. He's worn out by the work of his life. My God, he's worked his rear end off. And he's in the company of these religious women, who are caring for people and for him. And he's a crusty old guy. And he's in the chair and he's slipping away, and this nun, young novice nun, is wiping his brow with a cloth just to cool him down. And he says to her, and it's the last line of the movie, it's a powerful line. He says to her, "Pray, sister, that those we assist will not mistake our efforts for mere charity." Powerful. What is owed to persons? Not just the scraps that fall to the floor. What is owed to persons? This stunning observation of Vincent's that there is something more than charity is precisely the issue that comes to the fore in Europe, especially in the 18th century and throughout the world over the next couple of centuries. Basically, it's focused around the issue of industrialization, which hits in various parts of the world at various times. First and primarily on the continent in France and in Germany and in England, and then spreading from that kind of core out further and further to other parts of the continent and the world. What is a characteristic of this industry? And it's still going on today. I mean, China is experiencing this industrialization. Centuries later, they're catching up with it. It involves issues of energy and power, among other things. Of course it does. Massive centralization that goes on. So you have the transfer of population from the country to the city. Traditional villages, tribal relationships, family settings are all sundered. And people are literally dumped, not just once, but for generations, into the shanty towns that surround, and I hate to use them, I won't use the word, find some other word, that are part of the city, part of the world. There's a total and complete disconnection in family values, family connectedness. Men are separated from women. There is some deep and profound harm that takes place in that alone. I used to watch the behavior of my colleagues in the seminary when women would appear. It's very interesting. The way they would, primp up and fix up their lives, and all of a sudden they weren't the slobs that they were. It works non-verbally almost. It's reality. It's the way things are, and absent this relational possibility, you have very stressful circumstances that emerge, and often very violent ones that emerge. Particularly as being a pastor, and I had 3 parishes and 5 different communities. One of the parishes had 2 different communities. One was a kind of lower middle class northern transplant community in South Carolina, and the other was a booming Mexican community. And the issue for the Mexican community was the single male. These boys, whether they would graduate or not, many of them wouldn't, because they were so tempted by the toys of the world. The red car, the red pickup, had to be red for some reason or another, I don't know. Anyway, and I blessed any number of these things. They make one payment, then they lose it, whatever. But any event, and they want to go to work. And so often they'd end up in scab labor jobs and so on and so forth, and Gunga Din-like jobs and so on and so forth. But they thought it was great because now they had money on their own and so on. But They are on their own, and they are separated out from their family. It's like rogue elephants. And these youngsters now, with a little bit of money and a Friday night and a lot of booze, become frightening. And talk about the gangs. This is pre-gang. They're not organized, but they're just mobile. They're just flowing in and out of families. They're bumping into people. They're big. They're uncontrollable. It's a rough world. It's a rough world. So it's going on all over the place, even now, industrialization. And with this booming urbanization, there is little shelter. The water is in sewage and food and public health. They are not to be considered cost factors in employment. All the employers have to do is provide wages to keep them going from day to day. And usually for long hours as well. We can see this in examples in China, for instance, 7-day work weeks. And you have the result is suicides, people working for Sony or whatever in these sweatshops, and enforced captivity in these locales. They're jumping out of windows. It's a terrible, terrible life. And profits from this mass production flow to the investors and the managers. Ample descriptions of social consequences can be seen amongst many examples in the novels of Charles Dickens. It's all there. By the mid-19th century, especially in Germany, under the leadership of the Bishop of Mainz, Wilhelm von Ketteler, and many people, German Catholics in academia and working in labor, they named the emerging crisis what they called the social question, to which Leo XIII and numerous popes and other Catholic agencies have focused upon over the next 100 years. I've included a page listing some of the major Catholic social teaching over the last 100 years. It's in here. It starts with Rerum Novarum, and it goes up to, I think I included at the end the encyclical of Francis on Laudate Si, the understanding the issue of ecology as a social justice issue because of its consequences for the poor, particularly, who are confronted with rising tides and so on and so forth. The consequences of church social moral teaching, as I indicated at the beginning, were tremendous throughout Europe, but transformative in the United States, where labor strife had reached lethal dimensions. John D. Rockefeller commissioned the Pinkerton Guards to break up demonstrations in the mines in Colorado. The local churches, yes, parishes in Michigan, in Detroit, in Pittsburgh, and around the middle part of the United States, frequently with Episcopal approval and support, actively supported workers' rights. The National Council of Catholic Bishops, founded, among other things, by a Paulist, John Burke, founded in the 1912-1914 period. The Council of Catholic Bishops, with the enormous intellectual help and support of Monsignor John Ryan, who had a doctorate in economics as well as a doctorate in theology. And he headed the Office of Social Ethics at Catholic University and also the Office for the Bishops from 1915 to 1946. Monsignor Ryan was considered, his biography is entitled Right Reverend New Dealer. He wrote the bishop's statement in 1919 on the reconstruction of the American economy and the American social fabric. And one of the major, not the only one, child labor laws. getting children out of the workplace, or working hours and hours with meager pay, et cetera, et cetera. Changing all of this, providing benefits for workers so that they, particularly for men particularly, so that they could raise their families in dignity. It's just not that one talent for one day's work. It's in order that they can prepare their children for educational purposes and so on, and health provisions and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of things that get pulled together. Let me skip ahead just to underscore maybe one last point here. One of the elements that Catholicism has underscored, particularly with John Paul II, to some extent with John the 23rd, and also the American bishops as well, is the issue of what is generally called the right to participate in society. The right to have a voice. This again is in juxtaposition to that concern of Vincent de Paul. Pray that they will not think that what we offer them is mere charity. Justice is what has to be offered. And part of justice is allowing the poor, the disenfranchised, men and women and children of various ages and talents and so on, to have a voice in their own life. A contrary example is I once gave, not this talk, but I gave something like this. I was asked to come down to help out in a parish outside of Roanoke, Virginia, for 3 weeks in 1983 in the summertime. God, it was hot. And I preached one Sunday on Catholic social teaching. And this gentleman told me how impressed he was by it and invited me to play golf with him during the week. And we went out and played. And I don't know what hole this came up, but at some point he said to me, he said, "Oh, by the way, Father, I want to tell you that General Electric is leaving the area. It's the largest employer in the area. We're leaving within a year, closing up completely." So I said to him, I said, "Who knows this?" He says, "Well, senior management knows." After parentheses, after all, they have to think about their families, their children, relocating, transferring their jobs and moving to some other place, etc. Nobody else has this concern? The other 1,500 people that worked there, that provided for their families, and so on and so on, and the other 3,000 to 4,000 people who counted on these people to, with their distribution of money, to buy groceries and all kinds of goods and services in the community, these people were going to get slammed. And I said, "You mean you're not telling anyone other than the senior management?" He said, "That's right." He says, General Electric just doesn't have a policy with regard to telling the workers anything. Some years later, I met Jack Welch. It was kind of a frightening experience. A man utterly unhinged. This issue is a large issue. It does come down to something like this, though. Underscoring the immense and ongoing dimensions of the social question. And of course, we've made only just a reference to Laudato Si and the environmental issues and social justice. The Church enunciates these, the principles of social justice with the accompanying understanding of the gospel of Jesus that begins, "Repent, change your mind or heart, the reign of God, of solidarity with brothers and sisters, where no one is excluded and all are welcomed and loved, is at hand." I think that is the driving force behind the church's efforts at social justice and the concerns that it has for the people who have little voice, little opportunity to participate, to share in the goods of this world, in the common goods. And clearly we are faced with this issue over and over again, even in whatever we think of as our enlightened world today. Okay, so let me stop with that. There was the whole issue of law and morality, which I barely touched upon, which would require a much lengthier conversation about, but maybe we'll get to that at some point or other. Okay? Mm-hmm. I've certainly gone on a long time. Do you have any questions or concerns? Or
You mentioned that you talked about Catholic social teaching at a Mass.
yes.
How priests usually have their homilies on the readings.
Yes.
So how do they get across Catholic social teaching? How do they,
Well,
can they incorporate
yes,
that?
it's a good question. And I forget the genesis of the moment for me in terms of that event. There are times in the life of the church, be it something that comes up in the church, it comes up in the world, be it issues of violence, of reconciliation in the community or lack thereof. Karl Barth, a very famous Protestant theologian, used to say, I preach with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. And one has to be careful about this, how one, in terms of, so there are times when I would not so much dispense with the gospel, so to speak, but say, today I would like to focus on this concern, given these reasons. A more topical kind of thing. For heaven's sakes, we're constantly asking people to give money for this or that. We see no problem. God loves a cheerful giver. I don't know if that's in there anywhere. But anyway, and there are some texts in here about social justice in terms of the Old Testament, New Testament. But I think one has to be, it's careful about how one goes about doing that. I think it has to be engaged. I did a series once at universities. I did a series on sexuality. Did I get their attention? And the first 2 weeks, I spoke or the other priest spoke. And the third week we had a married couple speak. And it was very interesting, that whole experience. First of all, it was the topic of conversation on the university campus for the next 3 weeks. Do you know what Father Campbell said yesterday about something or other? And they were off. They were just absolutely, that somebody was talking about this sort of stuff. And they were what I was more impressed by and more pleased by was not so much whatever I said, but the fact that they started talking to each other. Mm-hmm. I do remember with regard to the married couple that several married couples, and we didn't have an old crowd. We had a fairly young crowd, young faculty, professional people. We had about 20 physicians there and so on. Some of them were shocked that this married couple was talking about sexual intercourse. Because they didn't want their kids to hear about it. So anyway, whatever. I appreciate that. I said, well, you make a choice. You come to a place like this. It's whether you think it's it's comfortable liberal Christianity or Catholicism, but here's a moment where you're getting challenged. Yeah. And I certainly tried to warn them ahead of time, and I didn't, but whatever. And so, so they had to live with it and deal with it. But that was a lot of fun to see, and I've done that a couple of times over the years with different groups, and particularly in terms of the misbehavior at university campuses, often tied up with booze, with regard to sex and the abuse of women. It's almost 95% of it is related to booze. And I'd go to everybody. I said, will you please stop the drinking, or discipline it much more closely? You can't have laws that you have to be able to enforce the laws, but you ought to enforce. I went to some of these dorms, but the kids had liquor that I had never seen in my life. I'm not exactly a prude, but I mean, I was, oh my God. And at Clemson, they used to refer to Thursday night as thirst night. And it was the beginning of a 3-day binge, which as a public health issue is a serious matter.